a Big Bang creating an ordered universe or some biologically complex organ coming about by accident. It just doesn't happen, right? And so they're positions of faith. It's past events that we can't replicate and we cannot experiment with. Number two, we're going to go through the analysis of the Genesis flood. We're going to just go marching right through Genesis chapters 7, 8, 9 through there. We're going to go through the flood record. And then lastly, I'm going to give you some scientific evidence for geological catastrophe. So that's our outline for this session. Now, I'm going to throw up a quote here by a guy by the name of Bertrand Russell, who's an atheist, and here is his definition of faith. See how you like it. We may define faith as a firm belief in something for which there is no evidence. We may define faith as a firm belief in something for which there is no evidence. What do you guys think of that definition of faith? You're not liking it. Why not? It's not biblical, okay? Yes, it makes it seem like it's a blind leap. To me, that's a good definition for insanity, actually. See, because this is the problem, is they have a skewed view of what faith is. Faith is not check your brain at the door and just kind of like, okay, whatever goes, I'm going to just have to take a guess. I don't know what religion is right, but I guess I'll just pick this one and hopefully it all ends okay. We don't see that anywhere in the Bible. No, Isaiah 1:18 says, come now and let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. We see over and over where Paul goes into the synagogue and he disputes and proves that this is very Christ. Very strong Greek words of argumentation and marshaling evidence. And so God never asks us to check our brain at the door. He has given us our brain. He wants us to use it. He appeals to our intellect. And at the same time, he does require faith. As I discussed, God probably won't show up like a genie and create something for you. So at the end of the day, we do need faith. But this is biblical faith. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Now, let's just kind of tear this apart for just a minute. Look at this verse. Faith is the substance. Now, that word substance there, that's a scientific word. For example, if I got pure elements like hydrogen and oxygen, I combine them together, I'm going to get a substance called water. If I have carbon, pure carbon atoms over here, pure oxygen atoms over here, I combine them in a reaction, I'm going to get a substance called carbon dioxide, hopefully not carbon monoxide, right? Might not be so nice. But these are substances, okay? It's a scientific word. It's a very concrete word. So here we have this interesting juxtaposition where it says substance of things hoped for. Now we have to understand that that word hope in the Bible is not, well, I hope to win the lottery someday. It's rather a confident expectation. But it is things that we don't know for sure, that we are anticipating, we are longing for. For example, I hope to go to heaven. I hope to meet God. And so here we have a very scientific word alongside this word hope. And I think the author of the Hebrews is saying this. Biblical faith is so solid that it takes those things that we hope for that we can't see and takes them down so close that they can almost be touched like a substance. That's how strong biblical faith is. And then he says it's the evidence of things not seen. Now, we use that word evidence in the scientific arena, but there's another arena that uses it even more. Which one is that? The arena of law, the legal arena. Now, let's just say we're going into a court of law. And I'm going to pick on Brendan again because he's a good sport and he's sitting in the front here. And let's say Brendan is on trial. Maybe he threw a stone through somebody's window because he was mad at them, right? And let's just say that Christy back here is his attorney. And okay, so he's in court here, and he's got his attorney. And I get sworn in as a witness against him, and I said, okay, I didn't see anything, I don't hear anything, but as far as I'm concerned, he looks guilty. Now, if he's got a good attorney, the attorney's going to raise her hand and say, objection, I don't want to hear the witness's opinion about my client. What's the evidence? What did you see? What did you hear? Tell me about the footprints. Tell me about the fingerprints. But don't give me your opinion about my client. I'm going to object to that. Okay, so Usually we don't think of things that you haven't seen as evidence. And yet here we have, again, this interesting juxtaposition. It's the evidence of things not seen. Here's what I think the author of the Hebrews is saying. Our faith is so firm that we can take things we have not seen, things like God, things like heaven, things like angels and demons, and it can come down and it can make it so real that we could go into a court and we can bank our life on it. That's the nature of biblical faith. It's very concrete, it's very real, it's very solid, it's not a leap in the dark. And you see how different that is from the definition given by the atheist Bertrand Russell. Hebrews 11 verse 3, just a couple of verses later, says this: through faith we understand the worlds were framed by the word of God, so the things which were seen were not made of things which do appear. So the author of Hebrews talks about creation and says, we need faith to believe creation, but the things that we see were not made from something else. They didn't evolve from some prior state. God created it ex nihilo, out of nothing. See. And then we read in Hebrews chapter 11 about great heroes of faith. And we're going to talk about some of these great heroes of faith. Now, if you were here for our earlier sessions, you will remember this slide. We talked about the two-model approach yesterday. That is how I would like to see origins discussed in classrooms, is to discuss the evolution model and discuss the creation model and let young people make up their minds. That, I think, would be the most reasonable approach. You educate them on, hey, here's a couple of views out there, the two prominent views out there, and let them make up their own minds. That's a good way to educate. Well, on the creation model, we have origin by design. Okay, origin by design. Now, we talked about that in our discussion on 5 Qs. How do you get life from rocks? How do you get a Big Bang create an ordered universe? We have good evidence for design compared to natural origin. The idea of spontaneous generation, eternality of matter, flies directly against known scientific laws. So the evidence stacks up on this side. Our last session, we talked about the early Earth. What were the conditions on the early Earth? Were they less ordered and they're becoming more ordered over time? No. There's decreasing order. Things were bigger, healthier, lived longer. Things are going downhill. Entropy. So once again, you see the evidence stacks up on the creation model. Now, in this session, we're going to talk about that final point, and that is the great formations of this earth. Were they formed via slow and gradual processes, uniformitarian gradualism? Or were they formed very quickly, very suddenly, by massive catastrophe? That's what I hope to cover in this discussion. And I want to give you some evidence that, once again, it lines up on the side of the creation model as having catastrophe. Okay, Hebrews 11 verse 7, here we see this particular man of faith held up. By faith, Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house. So Noah is held up by the author of the Hebrews as this great man of faith. Well, as soon as you start discussing the Genesis flood, in scientific circles, they make fun of you. Did you know geologists have a big problem with the flood account? They have been attacking the flood account since the days of Lyell, really. Get Moses out of the sciences. Why do the geologists have such a problem with the flood? Why attack the flood? Well, I will tell you why. Because the flood, or the geology, the layers, are one of the better evidences for evolution, at least in their thinking. And if you get rid of all these millions and billions of years, you've just gotten rid of evolution along with it. See, the evolutionists believe that these invertebrates, these little clammy fellows, like, this, I got this fossilized clam here, and I got another fossilized clam here. These things evolved into something like this fishy fellow here, Nemo. And Nemo has a very important part to play in evolution because he evolves into this amphibian sort of a fellow here. So we have the Cambrian era, we have this Devonian era, we have the Permian at the time of the great amphibians, supposedly the fishy creatures that are crawling onto land. Then we have the Mesozoic, the period of the great reptiles, and finally the Cenozoic, the mammals. And all this supposedly one kind evolves from another. Well, if that all happened in a year of the flood, goodbye evolution. You see why it's a big deal? So even though the geologists attack it, did you know there's a universal flood belief in the traditions and languages of every major nationality? India, Sioux Indians, Greeks, Norse, Sumerians, Egyptians, 270 people groups have a belief in a flood. Well, where'd they all get it from? Well, it came out of Babel, right? As people spread out, they brought the truth and knowledge with them. Here is some of the people groups. In Hawaii, they say this, and by the way, this is before the missionaries came. They had this tradition. Long before the death of Kunahana, the first man, the world became a wicked and terrible place to live. There was one good man left. His name was Nu'u. Well, it's pretty close, right? He made a great canoe with a house on it, filled it with animals. The waters came up over all the earth and killed all the people. Only Nu'u and his family were saved. That's the Hawaiians. Then we have the Toltec Indians of Mexico, and they believe that the first world lasted 1,716 years and was destroyed by waters that submerged the highest mountains by 15 cubits. Only one family named Coxcox survived. Well, they got the name a little bit different there. But 15 cubits of water, that's pretty good. And this is about how long Genesis would say that the pre-flood world lasted as well. And then we have the Babylonians. Now, the Babylonians have the best flood account outside of the Bible. They believe in this Epic of Gilgamesh, these cuneiform tablets found in Babylon, that Gilgamesh took his family of 8 on a boat with 2 of each kind of creature and saved the world's creatures during the Great Flood. So close is the Gilgamesh epic to the Bible that some skeptics have suggested that the Jews stole the Gilgamesh story and pulled it into Genesis and incorporated it into their Bible. But recently, an even older tablet has been found than the Gilgamesh epic, and this is not well known, but there's a tablet called the Nippur tablet, 2011. This tablet was found in ancient Babylon. It's hundreds of years older than the Gilgamesh tablet, and this cuneiform tablet does not differ in any detail from the Bible, nor is anything added. So now which one is the more corrupted? Well, we usually look to the older ones as to being more pure, and this older one exactly agrees with the Bible. And the Gilgamesh one is the one that's kind of gone a little sideways and had some little things added to it. And so the good evidence there for the scriptural account being accurate. Well, the oldest intact civilization in the whole world is the Chinese. And the Chinese have some crazy old books like the Huanazi, which tells how the former times the poles that supported the roof of the world were broken, the continents broke apart, and there was a great flood. Now look at this one, the Shu Jing story, 1000 BC. That is an old book, right? 3,000-year-old book, that's an old book. And it talks about when the flood rose, the hills covered the mountains, drowned all living things. In the midst of this calamity, a hero named Nuwa, hey, that's really close, appeared to replenish the earth. So we have all these different flood records in nationalities that didn't even communicate. Now, as soon as you get talking seriously about the flood, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, how did Noah fit all these animals onto the ark? And people say, well, you know, there's no way he could get all these animals on. Well, first off, God brought them. He didn't have to go around with a tranquilizer gun, boom! Okay, Shem, haul them aboard. God brought them to the ark. And number 2, many did not need to come. Did they need to have goldfish bowls on the ark for the goldfish? No. Goldfish went swimming all over. They got a free world tour. Number 3, large animals can be taken as babies. So I talked about this in an earlier session. I mean, you got 2 choices. You want to take the big grandpapas or you want to take the young ones? Well, you're going to take the young ones because they're easier to handle, they eat less, they take up less space, and they're going to be able to procreate more after the flood. So you're going to take the smaller ones. And then number 4, provisions could be stored for those who did not hibernate. A lot of animals can hibernate when climatic conditions get bad enough. In other words, they may not hibernate as a rule like bears, but they can hibernate, go into dormancy if there's really bad catastrophe out there. So perhaps some of them hibernated. But then number 5, Noah's Ark was huge. I'm talking really, really big boat. Like, think about a football field and a half. How many of you have been able to go to the Ark encounter? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, a few you have. May I highly recommend. Pastor, maybe you should organize like a, a church trip or something. It is awesome. It is well worth going. Okay, he's in. I can see that right now. Maybe I'll come down through. We'll all go, It's really good. I've been once. It was early on, and they've added a lot of things. I want to go again. But this is the boat that they made there. And you can see, I mean, this is huge. And it didn't have to have a rudder or engine. It just had to float. It didn't have to even go anywhere. I mean, who cares? They didn't care where they went. It just had to float. And so there's lots of space on this thing. The analysis was done by Henry Morris in his book, Genesis Flood, and it's hard to improve on it. It's pretty accurate. He says this: there are 2.5 million macroscopic, now looking at the microscopic stuff, macroscopic creatures on the earth. 60% are aquatic. They don't have to come on board. Of the 40% that are left, 70% are insects. They could go in on the hide of an elephant or a hippo, right? They took a ride. There's only a few thousand kinds, most smaller than a dog. The capacity of the ark was equivalent to 522 railroad stock cars. 73 such stock cars could have carried all the animal kinds. So you got lots of room on the ark. Lots of room for Noah's family, food, all that good stuff. All right, there is point number 1. Now let's look at the biblical record. What I want to do is go to the Bible and begin to march through the biblical record and talk about some scientific implications of this flood. And as you look at the biblical record, it breaks into 3 periods. The first period is the onslaught. That's where the water levels are coming up. Then there is the prevailing, where the water is just covering the earth. It's not going up and it's not going down. And then finally, there's the abatement. That's where the water's coming back off of the earth. So those are the 3 periods that the Bible kind of neatly breaks the flood down into. Then we read in Genesis 7, verse 11, the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, very specific, the same day were the fountains of the great deep broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. Biblically, what are the 2 sources of the flood water? The sky above, the fountain, the windows of heaven, and underneath, the fountains shooting up. I wouldn't so much say the sea, but there was probably these high-pressure chambers of water under the earth's crust, okay? And something made them burst open and come shooting out at this point. So the fountains of the great deep and the windows of heaven. Now remember, if you were here for our last session, we talked about this theory that the earth was in a bubble, in a water vapor canopy. So perhaps at this point, something comes in, maybe a comet, maybe a swarm of asteroids comes in and smacks into the earth and causes that water vapor canopy to condense and begin to pour water for 40 days and 40 nights down upon the earth. We do know that there's some big craters. At one point, the earth got whacked. In fact, even the moon on one side of it has a lot of craters. So it got walloped too. So at one point, the earth came through a meteor swarm, and there are some massive craters that exist. One down the Yucatan Peninsula. There's another one even bigger in Australia that's under the Australian outback. Maybe this is when the earth got its wobble. Now you notice that the earth is on an axis. It's kind of hard to see that orange axis there. But it spins on its axis, and there's a slight tilt, which gives us our seasons. But then also, as it's spinning, it has a slight wobble, kind of like a top that you're spinning really good, and you give it a bump, and it kind of is doing this while it's still spinning. And that is called precession. And so maybe that's what caused that. We don't know for sure. But here's one thing that's interesting. If you start looking at the biblical account, you will notice that the ages drop off dramatically after the flood. So before the flood, they're living 900 years pretty consistently, and then all of a sudden the flood comes, and kapow, the ages start to drop off. And in short order, they're living 100 and some years, not too different than today. What happened? Again, it's just a theory, but I think it lines up pretty good with that theory of the water vapor canopy. That's my guess. Now this is interesting. If we took all the water and sucked it off with a gigantic straw, that's what the Earth would look like. There is this rip, this tear right here that goes right down the middle of the ocean. It's called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. What's that? I think that's where the fountains came squirting out. So in other words, it was one continent, and then kapoof, the comets, asteroids hitting the Earth, start to break up the crust. This water comes shooting out, driving the continents apart, and that is where it ripped. That's where it tore. That's where these underwater chambers came smashing out there. Fountains of the great deep broke up. And so this would have been very violent. It would have spewed water high in the atmosphere, and it would have provided most of the flood water. Some of it came from rain, but most of it came from these chambers under the earth. Now I'm going to show you a little animation to show you what it may have looked like at the time of these fountains breaking out. It would have been really ferocious, very scary to have the earth ripping apart, bursting up, and these trees just getting blown over. It would have been a terrible time not to be on the ark. Very, very frightening. Well, scientifically, we have some interesting stuff going on. We have continental plates broken apart. We have the bursting of the chambers. They're carrying a lot of dirt and rocks up in the air, which would land elsewhere as dirty rain, not just water, but dirt and sand and even rocks. And then extensive volcanic eruptions and earthquake activity from all this tearing up of the Earth's crust and the continents beginning to move apart. Now, when you have earthquakes and crustal shifts, it causes massive waves. We have even a small earthquake in the ocean, it'll cause a tsunami to come up onto the land. Now, if you've got a tsunami and it's carrying a lot of mud and debris and sand with it, what's the first creatures that are going to get buried? Sea creatures. So before the tsunami even hits land, it's maybe hitting those reefs offshore, and some of these creatures that are living in these reefs are getting buried. They don't even know it's coming. They're just sitting there, duh, and boom, they get buried. We have fossilized clams, marine invertebrates. What's an invertebrate? What does invertebrate mean? Who knows? Yes?
I think it's like the not being able to...
It doesn't...
No backbone.
That's right, very good. Gold star has no backbone. So 95% of all our fossils are marine invertebrates. 95%. Of the 5% that are left, most of those are algae or plant fossils. Only 0.01, like 1/100% are vertebrates, and those are mostly fish. The fossil record is best understood as a marine cataclysm. That's the big picture of the fossil record. We got lots of these guys. We got these guys on the tops of mountains. Mount Everest has got fossilized clams on top of it. Well, how did they crawl up there? Especially if they're fossilized. Can we say flood? It was all underwater once? But why are they fossilized closed? Why is that interesting? Who knows? Yes? Yeah, very good, Ruth. When clams, they're gigantic muscle. When they die, when you boil them and cook them, muscle relaxes, they open up, right? That's how you eat them. But these are fossilized closed. They were buried alive. They probably died by fossilization. That's probably the way they were killed. That's how fast it was. So they got buried under huge amounts of sediments, intense pressure, and they got fossilized very, very fast. Couldn't happen slowly, because then they would have died and opened up. Now, the Bible says in Genesis 7:19, the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole of heaven were covered. So now the water's coming up onto the land. It was in the ocean, covering marine invertebrates. Now it's coming up onto land. And probably about now is when the ark is getting carried up. And probably these guys here are realizing they made a big mistake, right? A big mistake. And so you have these massive waves licking at the edges of the continents. And scientifically, we have some interesting stuff going on. We have tremendous amounts of erosion. We have low-lying areas would be covered. Swampy areas would be covered first as it comes up onto the continents. And then we have debris pools as things are getting swept down and they're getting carried to these swamps, and then the water slows down there and they get all stuck together in a big debris pool. And then in Genesis 7:20 it says 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail and the mountains were covered. So now everything is covered. And even those creatures that were trying to scramble up to the high country because they had a little bit of a brain, they're trying to run away or the waters are coming up, okay, they're now getting covered. And so why is it 15 cubits up? Well, the reason it's 15 cubits, the ark was 30 cubits high, and obviously it would sit maybe about halfway down in the water. So God wanted to make sure there's plenty of water so the ark could float over even the tallest mountains. Now, scientifically, cool stuff's happening. Masses of vegetation are getting carried down, swept down. All kinds of grasses and trees and bushes are just getting eroded down and all plopped together in the swamp areas. In mass, huge masses of vegetation are getting buried by dirt. That will become the coal layers. Rising floodwaters cover the higher ground, and now some of the larger, more mobile creatures are caught and are buried in the higher levels. We have, in a number of places on the earth, fossil graveyards. What's a fossil graveyard? Well, it's an area where all kinds of skeletons of creatures are all packed in on top of each other. For example, in the Gobi Desert. The Gobi Desert is a paradise for paleontologists. Freshly exposed skeletons sometimes look more like recent remains of a carcass than an 80-million-year-old fossil. Well, I've got news for Mr. Novacek, who writes in Scientific Americans. Maybe it was not an 80-million-year-old fossil, right? But here are some pictures of Gobi Desert fossils, and you see they have this kind of reddish coloration to them. Here are saber-toothed tigers, here we have dinosaurs, here we have crocodilians, and they're all just kind of buried, they're lumped together in one huge, gigantic fossil graveyard. These fossil graveyards are so common that if you go to major museums, they will have exhibits on fossil graveyards. Not just in the Gobi, but in other parts of the world we have fossil graveyards. So if you go to the Harvard Museum, for example, they have a display on fossil graveyards. You go out to the Carnegie Museum out in Pittsburgh, they've got a display on fossil graveyards. Now, here is a fossil graveyard that was in South Carolina. It's called the Ashley Beds. And it's an enormous phosphate graveyard that contained men and hadrosaurs and deer and plesiosaurs and dogs and iguanodon and sheep and woolly mammoths. Now, why did everything from thousands of miles around all come to one place to die? Well, no, it got carried by water, swept up with enormous waves, and then all kind of like plopped into one place. By the way, what's a plesiosaur? Is that a land creature? A plesiosaur is an ocean creature. What on earth is that doing buried in South Carolina along with dogs and sheep? I mean, these things shouldn't be buried together. Can we say enormous waves, gigantic flood, right? Look, that's a fossil graveyard. Look at all those ocean critters. Here's another one. Everything you see there is bone. Everything is bits of bone. And then the Bible says the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. Now the water's not going up. It's not coming down. It's just sitting there. Boom. All that pressure for 6 months. And they're in the ark. And the ark's going up, and the ark's going down. And it's going up, and it's going down. And I would have to think that no one in his family are saying, okay, Lord, anytime now you can get rid of that water. I mean, how many times can you play tiddlywinks with Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? Cabin fever. But there's some real interesting stuff going on scientifically. Underneath all that pressure, pressing down on all those layers, is turning these freshly buried organisms into fossils. It doesn't take millions of years to make a fossil. It can happen fast with the right minerals pressing down and lots of pressure. That's what makes a fossil. In fact, almost never do things get fossilized today. They get scavenged, they decay, but they don't get fossilized. It requires very special conditions. So we would say as creationists that pretty much everything that was fossilized got fossilized during the flood. The fossil record's like a snapshot of Noah's world. Then the extensive coal and oil deposits were created. And then the regular tidal flows, as the moon goes around the earth twice a day, would kind of stir up and then settle down the sediments. And we have sometimes thousands of fine layers of sediments that would have been formed during this time of the flood. Well, fossil fuels are a wonderful evidence of the flood. Did you know we have coal layers in Wyoming and Montana that go for 20,000 square miles? Well, can you show me anywhere on the face of the earth that something like that is happening today? 20,000 square miles of pure coal. I mean, we're not talking any sand, any rocks in there. It's beautiful black bituminous coal, 240 billion tons, slowly getting excavated. Lots and lots of coal. Something along the lines of a massive catastrophe laid that down. Well, we can make fossil fuels very quickly in the laboratory. Again, it just doesn't take millions of years. Don't buy that baloney. Engineers working at the U.S. Department of Energy in the Pacific Northwest National Lab reported they were able to transform harvested marine algae into crude oil in less than 1 hour. It doesn't take millions of years. It takes the right conditions, heat, pressure, and you can turn vegetable matter into oil or coal very quickly. Well, let me tell you a story about this little fella in the party hat. His name is a nautiloid. And I have a nautiloid fossil. Oh, you know what, man? Maybe I didn't bring up my nautiloid fossil. Or my beautiful wife stole it for her story. Well, nautiloids are this fella here, okay? It looks octopus, squid-like guy. And it used to be if you went to the Grand Canyon, there would be a sign that would tell you nautiloids are fairly rare, but if you know where to look for them, you can see some nautiloids. And for example, here is a fossil nautiloid. You see it there? Kind of cigar-shaped, right? And a guy by the name of Steve Austin, who was a creationist, was challenged by the evolutionists. How do you explain these big limestone layers in the fossil record? And so he began to study the limestone layers. He got his boat and he went all the way down, all the way top, through the whole Grand Canyon. And as he would just look at the red wall limestone, he'd go up there and check it out. As he began to study it, he began to find lots of nautiloids. It's just they weren't going like this. More often, they were just a circle, because the nautiloid's coming out at you. You following what I'm saying? In other words, the nautiloid is bisected like this. So it's a circle, but if you could dig back in, the nautiloid fossil goes into the cliff, away from you. And all of a sudden, there's Stephen Austin, began to find this red wall limestone, which was supposed to have been formed over millions of years by an ancient tranquil sea. He's finding billions with a B of nautiloids. Ooh, how come there's so many fossilized nautiloids? Again, fossilization is very rare. Well, then it got even better. He found out that the reason that they're all facing this same way, all kind of facing out of the cliff, is because there was a flow that oriented them. So literally, that whole red wall limestone, there's no way it could form over millions of years. It happened in one gigantic submarine flow that oriented all these nautiloids and hardened them like in cement. And so now if you go to the Grand Canyon, they had Steve Austin in to educate the park rangers, and they'll tell you the red wall limestone formed quickly, and there's billions of nautiloids in there. A gigantic catastrophe. Great evidence for the flood. Then Genesis 8, 1-3 says this, and God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. Now that's an Old English word for they started to run off. The waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of 150 days, the waters were abated. Now, when I begin to talk about the flood, the number one question I get is, well, where'd all the water come from? We talked about that, the underwater chambers and also the windows of heaven. The second most common question I get is this: where'd all the waters go? Who knows the answer? After the flood, where did it all go? In the ocean. Very good. Gold star for you, lady. Pastor pointed down. I think he was going the same direction with you. It's in the deep ocean basins. You see, there's so much water in the deep ocean basins that if you were to take a gigantic bulldozer and you were to plow the continents into the ocean, the water would be 8,000 feet deep, about 1.5 miles over all the earth, even now today. That's how much water there is in these deep ocean basins. Lots of water. And in fact, if we look at a topographical map, okay, we're here in New York City. There's Boston, up close to where I live. Down there's DC. Okay, if you start going off the eastern seaboard and you go down, down, down slowly, and then boom, it drops off into what they call the abysmal plain. So this is the continental shelf here. That, I'll outline it in red, is where the drop-off happened. So think about this. The water's over the whole earth, and all of a sudden the ocean, which again is pretty new, it just happened there, it just spread out, gets cool and begins to drop down, and the continents begin to kind of bubble up, and the water runs into the deep ocean basins. You say, well, Dave, you sound pretty sure of that. Well, actually, the Bible tells us that. Psalm 104 is talking about the flood. Go look it up someday. And it talks about the flood, and it says this: at thy rebuke, they, the water, fled. At the voice of thy thunder, they hasted away. Well, where did it go? Well, it says in verse 8, they go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys. The ESV says it this way: the mountains rose up, the valleys sank down. And it went bloop down into the ocean basins. That's where it is. And that's where we see it still today. Well, this would have caused some other interesting things scientifically. Now the ark comes, lands on the mountains, but we have this uplift of the mountain basins and the sinking of the ocean basins. Erosion, massive amounts of erosion, canyons dug out as the water runs off. Freezing at the poles, and the higher elevations would cause glaciation. So after this time, we begin to have no water vapor canopy, and it starts to get very cold, especially at the north and the south. In Genesis chapter 8, in verse 5, we read this: the waters decreased continually until the 10th month and the first day of the month were the tops of the mountains seen. And so obviously you know the rest of the story. God allowed Noah to come off with all the animals, and he put this big rainbow up as a promise that he would never do it again. But obviously it was a signal of a changed environment. You know, if the rainbow was the first rainbow and it was the first rain, well, that means that something different was going on before that. And I would believe that water vapor canopy and the misting was the way that they watered the earth before that. Okay, let's talk about the Ice Age for a minute. I had somebody come to me and said, I don't understand the Ice Age. I don't get it. I don't know where it fits in biblically. It doesn't make sense to me. Well, let's just talk about it for a minute. If you have a global flood, the natural result afterwards is an Ice Age. You can't stop it. It just happens. So what do you mean by that, Dave? Well, the water is very warm because you just had all this hot water come shooting out from the fountains of the great deep. You just had the separation of the continents. You have a lot of lava that's flowing into there, and you just have really warm ocean basins. So because the water's warm, you have lots of evaporation. I forget what's El Nino or La Nina, but one of those is like causes lots of evaporation, huh? La Nina? Okay, and that causes hurricanes, right? So you would have had lots of evaporation, all those clouds, that warm, hot air is coming over the continents. Well, at the same time, these volcanoes are putting a lot of dust still in the air, even after the flood. So you have the sun obscured to a large degree. So the continents are very cold because you hardly have any sun warm in them. So it's like you have overcast day over overcast day over overcast day. Did you know that some of the major eruptions, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, even Mount St. Helens in the western United States, caused major shifts to the climate because it blotted out the sun? So we would have had cold continents, all this warm air comes over, and it begins to snow like crazy. Well, those snow layers build up, they get compacted, they turn into ice. They get really huge and they begin to expand and crawl and cover the landscape. We call them glaciers. And as they begin to move, they gouge out land. And we can see telltale signs of where the glaciers got to and where they stopped. and they actually came down as far as Kansas. That's how much ice there was. But there was one ice age. And the evolutionists like to talk about lots of them. There was one. It was after the flood, maybe lasted for a couple, 300 years, and then it began to melt back. So global warming, yeah, it's always been warming. Climate change, yeah, the climate always has changed. In fact, it was really bad in those days because the Earth is still kind of recovering from this huge catastrophe. But that's when there was the Ice Age. Go back and look at Job sometime. Read through it and see how many times it talks about snow, hail, ice, sleet. Crazy lots. Job's the oldest book in the Bible. It was written not too long after Babel. They were still in the Ice Age. Yep. A lot of ice, a lot of water was stored up on the continents. And so as the animals from the ark begin to spread out, you could walk from there to there. You could walk from Florida to Cuba. You could walk from Russia, Siberia, to Alaska with land bridges. That helped the animals disperse and refill the earth. But as the Ice Age came to an end, the water level came up, all of a sudden you couldn't walk to these places anymore. All right? Well, let's wrap things up. Actually, let's do this. Everybody stand up. Stand up. Stretch. Whoa, raise your hands. Deep breath. Get your blood flowing. You just had a nice meal, and you're tempted to fall asleep because it's nice and warm in here, and everybody's so comfortable. I'm going to make you uncomfortable. It'll help us all stay awake. Okay, so just grab a seat again. By the way, thank you so much for ladies for getting the meal together for us. I don't know who all did it, but thank you, 1,000 thank yous. It was delicious. We all thank you. Our stomachs thank you. It was wonderful. Okay, let's just quickly touch on scientific evidence for geological catastrophe, and then I'll let you go today. How do we know these rock layers happened quick, not over millions of years? Do we have some solid evidence? If someone were to tell you, I think it took millions of years for the Grand Canyon to form, how would you respond? Do we have a leg to stand on to say, no, what happened quickly during the flood? So I would suggest you take some notes right now. This is a good place for you to jot down some responses to those who believe in millions of years, and they say the rock layers prove it. Okay, I'm going to give you some evidences for them forming quickly and catastrophically. Number one, if you're taking notes, number one, polystrate fossils. Polystrate fossils. Well, what is a polystrate fossil? A poly, many, straight would be strata, rock layer. So it's a fossil that goes through multiple rock layers. For example, here's a tree, and it goes up and down through multiple lower layer and an upper layer, including layers of coal even. Here's another one. This one's really cool because this same tree is coalified here, and it's fossilized there. There it becomes part of the limestone. Here it becomes part of the coal. It's a 30-foot tree. There's hundreds of these found down in Cookeville, Tennessee, and the top and the rock layers are dated to completely different geological ages. Now, you mean to tell me that tree stood there for millions of years without rotting while these layers could form around it? It doesn't make sense, does it? No, that first layer got buried, and then the second one had to come right fast, right on top of it. Evidence of rapid formation. But we don't have just trees, we have creatures. I got this little trilobite here, okay? This is a little kind of small, harmless sort of a dude. He's a little bit like an ocean version of a beetle. He's got these long, kind of feelers, and he's just crawling along the bottom. And I can almost imagine, here's a little trilobite, gets up in the morning, stretches, okay, I'm going out in the day, I'm ready, psych, okay, let's go. And just as he starts going out at his breakfast, along comes a huge wave and goes wham and buries him in mud. He goes, uh-oh, it's going to be a bad day. And he begins to dig his way out from the mud, and he gets to the surface, whew. And just about the time he starts walking again, another big wave comes in, wham, buries a whole other layer of mud on him. Ugh. I knew it was going to be a bad day. And he likes to kill himself to finally dig out of this thing and start crawling on the surface again. And then another big wave comes in and buries him and kills him. And it was a bad day. And we actually have the fossil. Look at this. This is kind of cool. Here's the trilobite, and he's kind of covered with sand, so it's hard to make him out. But there is his crawl trail, and it goes deeper, 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 goes through that layer, and goes down 2 more layers. Now, you mean to tell me those layers were millions of years old and were solid rock, and he was crawling up through solid rock? Doesn't make sense. It's polystrate fossils. Number 2, if you're taking notes, surface features, raindrops, ripples, and tracks. We have lots of places on the earth where tracks are fossilized. We talked about some human tracks and dinosaur tracks this morning, but there's lots of places where we have ripples. You see these ripples here, and we have tracks. Now I need to pick on somebody. Who's got a pet? You got a pet. Chrissy's got a pet. No, you don't. You got a pet. What's your pet's name? Speedy? Speedy Chance. Is your pet a cat or dog? It's a fish. Okay, a fish is bad for my illustration. Does anybody have like a cat or a dog? Yes, right here. What do you have?
A turtle and a rabbit.
A rabbit.
And a dog.
And a dog. What's the dog's name?
Okay, the dog, Lucky.
Lucky. Okay, let's say that Lucky is out for a little walk in the backyard. And all of a sudden it starts raining, makes a lot of mud, and Lucky goes walking through the mud and leaves footprints. Now, how long are those footprints going to last? Are they going to last out there for 6 months or for a year or 5 years? No, why not?
Because they'll get like covered by other people's footprints.
Yeah, other people will step on them, or maybe the water keeps going up and the mud kind of collapses, or maybe it dries out and they crumble and fall in. The only way you can preserve something delicate like a footprint is if another layer comes very quickly after the footprints are made and covers them with a layer of sediment, which hardens like cement and preserves it so that when we pull these rocks apart, we can see all these tracks preserved. You see what I'm saying? It has to be quick. It can't be left on the surface for months and years. And so this is evidence of the next layer coming very quickly while the bottom layer is still soft and has the record of all these tracks. Surface features. Number 3, conforming layers without biosoils or erosion. Oh, don't get scared now. Don't get scared. A little bit of geology. I'm just going to give you a little geology. It's easy. You'll get it. Conforming layers means the layers are all laying on top of each other. Boom, 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 boom. If this one's flat, that one's flat. If this one's bent, the other one's bent. That just means they're conforming to each other. They're all laying on top of each other. You've seen these kind of conforming layers just driving down the side of the road, and sometimes they blast to put the road through. You've seen these layers on the sides of the roads. But here's what you maybe didn't notice, and I want you to watch for when you're driving around out there. It's rock, 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 rock. You don't see evidence of erosion where brooks flowed. You don't see where grasses and trees dug their roots in and where ants made burrows and little ground squirrels dug in there and worms worked it. We just see rock, rock, rock. You just see rock layer, rock layer, rock. What, you mean for millions of years there was no burrowing activity? There was no ants digging? There wasn't any trees putting their roots in? Doesn't make sense. If this layer was there, maybe 100 million, this layer's 10 million, this one's 5 million, this one's 2 million, that one's maybe 100,000. Well, where's the evidence of all that time and biological activity? You see what I'm saying? Or even erosion, which happens. Oh, we see it up here, but this looks like boom, boom, like pancakes, like layer cake. Now look at this mountain. I mean, where's the evidence for millions of years? It's just one layer upon the other, pure rock. Conforming layers without biosoils or erosion. Clastic dikes. Oh, these are fun. You're going to like this. So sometimes we have layers, and this layer squirts up into that layer. So you got some bubbles up here, a little bit of a void, and the bottom layer goes and squirts up into the top layer. Question, what does that tell us about this bottom layer? It was soft still. If it had been sitting there for a million years and was hard as a rock, is it going to squirt up into some of these holes and bubbles of the next layer? No, it had to be boom, one layer, boom, the next layer, boom, the next layer. And look, sometimes it can erode away, but if the bottom layer is a little bit harder stone, it might be left. And here we have places on the earth where we have these clastic dikes sticking up like, whoa, what's that? Well, it's because the bottom layer was harder. It's squirted up there, and sure enough, if you dig down here, you find a gray layer, but here it's squirting up over this brown layer. Pretty cool, but evidence of rapid deposition, rapid layering. I got one more for you. Distinct layers bent together. Distinct layers bent together. Okay, so here we have conforming layers. Let's say there's a little bit of a landslide or maybe earthquake or something kind of shakes the ground a little bit, and kaboop, they all bend together. Question, could this layer be millions of years older than these layers? If this layer is even 100 years older and completely dried and brittle, what's going to happen? Snap. It's not going to bend like that, right? But watch this. A whole mountain of bent layers. Excuse me, can you show me somewhere on the face of the earth that that's happening today? Anywhere? A whole mountain of layers getting bent? Look at this. There's a person right there. You see him by the fence post? Can somebody say amen? I love this stuff. This is awesome, man. Flood. Hello. All these bent layers. See, and if you drive down the highway, watch for it. You'll see this stuff. Evidence of catastrophe. Look at all those layers. Oh, my goodness. That looks like toothpaste, man. I like what Ken Ham says. What is the fossil record? Basically, it's billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. Basically, it's a gigantic monument to the Genesis flood. That's the fossil record. Okay, now we're going to have some fun. We're going to talk about ooparts. I love ooparts. What's an oopart? An oopart is an out-of-place artifact. And here we have a hammer. Now, some folks were traveling, walking along the river down there in Texas by the London Falls, and they found this rock, and out of it what appeared to be a stick. And they said, that's kind of weird, so they got a chisel, and they hammered it open, and they broke it with the chisel, and lo and behold, there was a hammer in the rock. Well, you have to understand, this rock layer has dinosaur remains in it. It's a Cretaceous layer, supposedly 65 million years ago, and there's dinosaur bones in this layer. Well, wait a minute. What is a hammer doing in a layer that has dinosaur bones? People aren't supposed to be around yet. Was there a hammersaurus that was making these things? Probably not. I rather think that whoever made this hammer missed the boat. An out-of-place artifact. There's one more I'd like to tell you about. A guy named Newton Anderson in 1944 was getting some coal to put on his coal fire. He's a 12-year-old kid at the time, and his job was to keep the coal fire stoked. And so he wanted to get a lump of coal and bank the coal fire, and he had this lump of coal, and it kind of bobbled on his shovel, and it fell onto the floor and it broke in half. He took one half, and he went to put it on the fire, and he looked, and there was something sticking out of it. So, whoa, that looks interesting. He put it aside for the moment, took the other half, put it on the coal fire, went upstairs. The next day he went down, and he got a croquet mallet, and he began to whack at it, and he extracted this bell from the lump of coal. I have to understand, the coal in West Virginia is supposed to be 300 million years old, even before the time of the dinosaurs. And so this bell, found in 1944 by Newton Anderson, was analyzed at the University of Oklahoma, and it was found to be a bronze bell with an iron clapper. The clapper is a little thing inside that goes ding, 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 and bounces against the side. So two metals, bronze bell with an iron clapper. Now Genesis chapter 4:19 says this, Zillah, she bare Tubal-Cain, instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. That was the two metals they were using in the pre-flood world, brass and iron. You got a brass bell with an iron clapper. A antediluvian, a pre-flood artifact, an out-of-place artifact. Then we have problematic footprints. Well, we talked about the footprints in the dinosaur layers down the Paluxy River, but we also have a shoe print that squished a trilobite. Trilobite's supposed to be 600 million years old. We have a human footprint in Permian limestone. This is the time when the first salamanders are starting to crawl onto shore in evolution, and yet we've got a human footprint. A little bit of a problem. Out of place artifacts. Well, when I talk about the flood, sometimes I get asked by evolutionists this question. Okay, Dino Dave, you want to explain everything in the flood. How come the fossils are sorted into layers? Remember we talked about this a little bit in the beginning. They like to say, this evolved to Nemo, Nemo evolved to the dinosaurs, dinosaurs evolved to the mammals, and then eventually the birds came along. Well, Dino Dave, how can you explain why these things are in the lower layers and these things are in the higher layers? Does anybody know the answer? Yes. Some of these things that were higher up could move faster and could get away in a flood. Okay? That's part of the answer. Very good. There's another part of the answer, though. Yes?
They lived in different areas. The ones at the bottom lived like in the ocean, then as it climbed up, it would kind of gradually...
Excellent. Very good. These are the two number 1 and number 2 answers. Very good. Gold star, young man. Number 1, habitat. That's where they lived, and the water levels got higher and got up into the swamps, and then they got up into the higher country. And then number 2, mobility and intelligence. These guys are saying, whoa, let's get out of here. The water levels are coming up. These guys are just going, duh, oops, I guess we got buried. See? And so that's the reasons why it's sorted into the different layers. Here's a guy named M.E. Clark. He was a professor, University of Illinois, Urbane, and he built a flume apparatus. And he has these paddles, and he would put water in here, and he'd fill it up, and he'd get the water moving around in a current, and he'd put some particles in there, some slightly bigger pebbles, and then some sands, and then some very fine silts, and it all gets swirling around, then he'd pull the paddles up and just let to see what happened. And it would naturally form into layers, heavier layers at the bottom, medium, and then silt layers up top. Multiple layers happen naturally in moving current. It doesn't take millions of years. It just takes moving current and lots of debris, lots of mud, lots of sand picked up along the way. Now, for many years, the evolutionists like to point to Specimen Ridge to make fun of creationists. Have any of you been in Yellowstone? All right, a couple of guys been to Yellowstone. You've been to Yellowstone, Pastor. In Yellowstone, they have the geysers and they have other things, but one of the things in Yellowstone is Specimen Ridge. And Specimen Ridge is kind of a hill, it's kind of a mountain, and there are multiple layers, but we have trees rooted in these layers. And the evolutionists would laugh and say, Dino Dave, how in 1 year of the flood do you get 27 different forests growing? So this one gets buried, another one grows, it gets buried, another one grows, it gets buried 27 times, all in the 1 year of the flood while it's all underwater. For many years, creationists didn't have a good answer. The reason I bring this up is because just because we can't answer everything, it shouldn't worry us. That's the nature of science. There's always going to be new puzzles. There's always going to be new things to worry about, new things to figure out. That's just part of science. That shouldn't bother us. For many years, we didn't have the answer. But I'm going to hit pause right now, and we're going to come back and talk about this a little more in just a moment. But I want to talk about the big one. The biggest geological icon on the face of the earth called Grand Canyon. Oh, anybody been to Grand Canyon? Oh, it's awesome. I remember driving up to Grand Canyon and coming up to the edge, and my first sight was morning, and I'm looking, I'm going, oh, wow. And my kids are sitting there, and they're wicked embarrassed, but I'm singing, oh, Lord, my God, when I in awe, and people are looking at me, and wonder, consider, I didn't care. I was singing to Jesus, man. Hallelujah, this is beautiful. Your mom would do that too? Sister, you and I, man, we got to go do it. It's awesome. It's just, it's one of those amazing things on the face of the earth that is just shouts out the glory of God. But the Grand Canyon is a problem. You see, the Grand Canyon is something that we call an incised meander. The evolutionists want you to believe, and they will tell you at the Grand Canyon, that the Colorado River, down the bottom there, dug out this canyon over millions and millions of years. But let me explain to you, there are two kinds of rivers. There's the kinds of rivers that run real fast down the sides of mountains, whoosh! And those have tremendous power to carve rock. They carry a lot of sediments with them, small rocks and sand, and they're carving and carrying more as it goes. Then there's a second kind of river. That kind of river that goes through a fairly flat area, like through a field, and it's just meandering real slow. They're nice for swimming holes. And they go, a-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo, a-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. It is meandering. They're not carrying any sediment. In fact, there is any sand they're putting on a sandbar. They're just going nice and slow through the cow pastures. Well, guess what? This is a meandering river. It doubles back all over itself. How is it going to dig through solid rock? It's a problem. It's the wrong kind of river. But there's a worse problem. The Grand Canyon is actually a mountain. The water of the Colorado River enters over here at 2,800 foot elevation, but then the canyon goes up to 8,000 foot elevation, the Kaibab Plateau. Now, if there's a mountain here, since when do rivers climb up over it and erode it away? They do not flow uphill. They will pool up and find the quickest way to go out and around the mountain. You see, it is a big problem. And the geologists have been trying to figure out how it happened for a long time. Can I suggest to you that it happened within hours, maybe days, as the flood waters were running off the earth? You say, really, Dave? The whole Grand Canyon got dug out in a few days? Yeah, maybe even faster. Say, well, can you give any evidence for that? Well, I'm glad you asked. May of 1980, this is what Mount St. Helens looked like. It was a beautiful, pristine mountain. People hiked up it. Down the bottom was a beautiful lake called Spirit Lake. Coming out of the lake was a wonderful little mountain river called the Toutle River. And on May 17th, 1980, the mountain blew its top. And then it looked like this. The whole north slope began to slide down, and then the ash and the steam got uncorked, and then it looked like this, and then it looked like this, and then I wouldn't want to be the dude taking these pictures, because it got ugly. It deposited roughly 30 feet of 1,000-degree ash and pumice and gas, boom, down on the Toutle River Basin. And it completely blocked the river. And the river went up, up, up. The water level in the lake went up, 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 until finally it began to crest over the dam, and then it went through, whoosh. And in short order, it dug a canyon in hours. And we were there. We saw it. It is roughly 1/20th scale model of the Grand Canyon. It's 1,000 feet wide, 140 feet deep, and it happened in a few minutes by rapid water flow. Here is a lady down here just for comparison. But you look at these layers, and there's a layer, there's a layer, there's a layer, there's a layer, there's a layer. You might say, well, maybe those layers took millions of years to form. But we know what they are. It's the original landslide. It's the dust cloud. It's the second eruption. It's the pumice. It's the fine silt that settles out on the top. We know what all these layers were because we were there. And it happened fast. And it doesn't take millions of years. It just takes a catastrophe. And it naturally happens from water flow. So now it helps us understand what happened in the Grand Canyon as the water began to flow off the earth. This mountain is an impediment. It began to dig away a little bit, still soft layers. And as the water went down, it began to dig more and more and more and more and more. And the Colorado River is just a relic stream that's flowing through where the flood waters had already gouged out the canyon. Well, the story gets even better because the whole forest that was on this side of the mountain got blasted down, and you have all these mass of 1 million logs floating in Spirit Lake. For a long time, for years afterwards, all these logs are floating. Well, eventually they kind of get waterlogged, and some of this mass of logs begins to float upright because the root balls get heavier than the rest of it. Does that make sense? So they're like this, and they kind of go like this. And then eventually they fall down to the bottom. Here is Steve Austin and his buddy, and they are crazy enough. I mean, it's still smoking in the background. They're in Spirit Lake, and they're scuba diving down here to see what's going on. And they find logs landing upright at the bottom of the lake. And some fall first, and then more dust and debris settles out, and then some fall and hit on a higher level, and then dust and debris settles out, and then some hit, oh! Now we know what happened on Specimen Ridge. All these logs were floating during the flood, and they're falling out on different levels, and you know, more silt's getting dug up and sit, and then more fall out. And so the creationists went back to Specimen Ridge, and they looked at the tree rings, and sure enough, the tree rings matched up from the top of the mountain to the bottom of the mountain. They all grew at the same time. It's all flood catastrophe. But now we see it wasn't multiple forests. And by the way, there's no intact roots. There's only root balls in all those 27 layers on Specimen Ridge. Well, we could go on and on and on, but I've got to wrap things up. Let's go back to Hebrews to finish today. Hebrews 11 verse 6 says this, but without faith, it's impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. My friends, the only way to come to God is by faith. God is not going to force anybody to accept him. We have to have faith at the end of the day, but it's a very reasonable faith. Oh, we may not know all the answers to all the questions. Probably never will until we get to heaven. But God has given us lots of evidence that we have a very strong, very solid faith. But Jesus makes an interesting point in Matthew 24. He talks about the end times and references back to the days of Noah. And he says, but as the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered in the ark and knew not till the flood came and took them away, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now listen, is there anything wrong with eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage? No. I hope not. I mean, I'm happily married, and we just had a wonderful meal. So, but the point is that people get into the everyday things of life, and they forget about eternity. And in Noah's day, when Noah preached to them and said, the flood's coming, the flood's coming, the flood's coming, they didn't listen to him because they were busy having a good time living life. You know anybody like that? They don't want to listen to Christianity because they're busy living a good life? Oh yeah, they're all around us, right? Deluded, cold-hearted, busy chasing the academia or chasing the title on their business card, trying to climb the corporate ladder, trying to get a nicer car than the guy next door, right? I mean, they're just doing stuff. And they're hard and cold to attempts to win them to Jesus Christ. Well, look, that's nothing new. That was going on in Noah's day. And Jesus said it's going to happen in the end days. But Noah was faithful, and he kept preaching. And then watch this. Genesis 7:16. I always wondered about this verse. And the Lord shut him in. There was a day where God said, that's it, Noah, get on. The flood's coming. You've given him a century of warning. Time's up. Here comes the judgment. And then it says God closed the door. Why did God close the door? I thought a lot about that. I mean, you think Noah probably had planned to shut the door. I mean, he built this whole ark, and he probably had something to shut it with. Well, maybe God wanted to make sure it shut real good so that, it was water sealed. But I think there's a little more to it than that. You see, when the rain starts to fall, I can see the people all of a sudden saying, oops, that's not happened before. And the ground starts to shake. Uh-oh, this is bad. Remember what that guy Noah said? Let's go check out that ark. Maybe we'll just hang out there for a couple hours and kind of wait for this to pass. And so they start making their way en masse up the hill, and I can almost see them coming up to the ark and going, Noah, can we get on, please? And Noah, he's inside. We talked about there's plenty of room on the ark. But God has shut the door. Now listen, some of these guys may have been Noah's nephews and nieces, cousins, aunts and uncles. He had a big heart. He'd been preaching to him. If Noah could open the door, he probably would have, and he probably would have said, come on in. But God had closed the door. It was all done. There was a time when it was opened, and God's mercy was extended, and there was a time when the door got closed, and it was all done. Now follow me here. Jesus says in Luke 13:25, when once the master of the house is risen up and has shut to the door, and you begin to stand without and to knock at the door, saying, Lord, Lord, open unto us. And he shall answer and say unto you, I know you not, whence you are. That's a tough thing to think about, because that might be some of our neighbors, our friends, our work associates, our family members that are standing on the outside. But the day's going to come where God's going to close the door again on a whole generation. And it seems like it's been a long time, and they tend to mock us and say, we've heard the story before, and look, it hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. Christ is going to come again, and it will be the end of an opportunity for a lot of people. Folks, you've been a great audience. We've enjoyed visiting over the last 3 days, but let me just wrap up with a challenge for you. Are you on mission here in Brooklyn, New York? Time is short. The door's going to close. Noah preached and preached and preached, and he never got anybody saved but his family. Say, well, I've tried to reach people. Look, we can't take the Holy Spirit's job. Our job is to go. Our job is to proclaim. Our job is unashamedly, unabashedly to give out the good news, to invite people to come. Do you have a list of folks that you're working on and praying over and crying over? Does it ever get to the point where you can't eat and you say, God, I'm going to fast today to see somebody saved? We've got a group of us that pray in my house once a week, and we just pray and get on our knees and pray for unsaved people. And we've claimed 6 especially. Said, God, would you please save one of these over the holiday season? Now, thank God, over the last year, we've seen 3 saved off our list. Do you have people you're engaged with? Do you have a heart for the mission that moves the heart of God? Are you just eating and drinking and giving in marriage just like the world? It's not Pastor Jason's job to win Brooklyn, to win your neighborhood. Oh, he hired pastor for that. No, his job is to equip the saints to do the work of the ministry. Your job is to do the work of the ministry. I hope you're coming alongside this brother and saying, hey, pastor, what can we do to help out around here? I mean, here's my talents. What can I do to assist in this work? We're all in this together. And none of us are going to get out of this alive. This is all going to come to an end. And everything around us is going to burn up. What's going to last? The Bible, souls, work that we've done for Christ. See, that's what's going to last. Let's close in prayer. Every head bowed, every eye closed, nobody looking around. I've enjoyed so much visiting with you guys, but please catch my heart. This is more important than anything else maybe that I'll throw at you, and that is this. Are you active as a Christian in ministry? It's a good time to evaluate. We're going into a new year. Are you using your talents in this place for God? Are you actually serving rather than just warming a pew? Are you active in your community? Do people even know you're a Christian? If you were put on trial, is there enough evidence to even convict you in your community that you are a Christian? Maybe you're here today, you say, Dave, I'm a Christian, I've confessed Christ as Savior, but honestly, I'm not doing enough. Before God, I want to say I'm committing in 2019 to redouble my efforts, to get behind this pastor and this ministry and do my best to make a difference in my community. Is there somebody that would say that? I'm not going to pick on you, but I'd love to see your hand raised. I'd love to pray for you. I see that sister in the front. You put your hand down. I see that in the back. You put your hand down. I see that hand. You can put it down. Anybody else? I see that hand. Thank you. You can put it down. Okay, I see that young person. You can put it down. Yes. Father in heaven, you've seen these hands, Lord. There's nobody looking around but you, me, and the pastor. And Lord, we just right now say, in the name of Jesus, for the glory of the kingdom, God, may this be a turning point in some lives to say, that's it. I'm going to sell all out to Jesus. I'm going to start getting more active. I'm not going to be embarrassed of the God of all eternity with my friends. They are going to die and go to hell. It doesn't matter if they make a little bit of fun of me. I am going to stand up, and I'm going to be counted on, because this is my time. This is our church. This is our chance to do something for the precious Savior for all eternity. Lord, I ask that this would be a place of harvesting, that folks would get these cantata invitations in their hands and they'd give them out with some urgency and say, please make time for Jesus this holiday season. Please, the reason for the season is to hear the good news. Would you come to church with me? I'll save a spot for you. Can I pick you up? Lord, I pray there'd be some urgency to us doing work through this holiday season. Lord, I pray your hand of blessing on this church. I pray your hand of blessing on this lighthouse. I pray your hand of blessing on this pastor in the name of Jesus and for his glory.